Now that we've seen what kind of shapes that we can actually make, what can we do to make them move around? Well, let's just start by bringing up a rectangle, and I will click and drag while holding shift to make it a perfect square, and I'll rename this layer square. Again, just by selecting it, pressing enter, typing and enter again. Obviously, After Effects is capable of animation, and that's probably what you came to this class to learn. So how do we get this square to move around and control it to actually create something that looks interesting? Well, animation is done in After Effects through what are called keyframes. And you can think of keyframes just as recorded values in time. So if I close up the contents and go into the transform controls for this layer, you'll notice this stopwatch icon next to all of these transform controls. This stopwatch icon is how we set keyframes in After Effects. So let's say I want, at the start of my comp, at the very beginning of my timeline, I want this rectangle to be on the left side of my screen. I'll set it right there, and in fact, let's go into our properties panel and just make this a little bit smaller. Okay, so I've got a square over on the left side of my screen, and I want to tell After Effects at the beginning of my timeline, that's where I want this square to be. Well, all I have to do is click on that stopwatch, and that's exactly what I just told After Effects. I'm saying at frame 0, the very first frame of my comp, I want the position property to be 185.1 on the x-axis and 574.6 on the y-axis. And since I clicked that, the stopwatch is now blue, and we've got this other icon over here in our timeline. This is what a default keyframe looks like in After Effects. And it's just a visual indicator to let you know that there is a property value stored at this point in time. Now that that's stored, I can go forward maybe a second or so, click and drag this over to the right side of the screen, and now we're getting this trail connecting the two position values. And because I've already set one keyframe, After Effects automatically sets a second keyframe, recording the new position value. And if I click and drag my current time indicator and just scrub through here, there is animation happening between these two keyframes. Now this comp is 30 seconds long. I want to zoom in a little bit closer to these two keyframes. So I'm just going to press the plus key on my keyboard to zoom in a bit, and I can zoom out with minus. Another way to do it is just by clicking on this little mountain icon to zoom in and out, or even just interactively grab this slider. Lots of ways to do the same thing. To preview this animation, all I need to do is go back to the start of my timeline and press the spacebar, just like in Premiere. My square went across the screen. Now I need to drag this back to the beginning. If I want to preview that again, I'll press the spacebar one more time, and there we go. Between those two keyframes that I've set, After Effects is interpolating between the two, and that just means filling in the gaps. It's putting in all of the frames that it needs to get from point A to point B over this amount of time. And these little dots on this trail here are every single frame between those two keyframes. It's all the intermediary steps that After Effects generated for this square to travel along that path. This is called a motion path, and there's actually a lot that we can do with it. For instance, these two circles right here, these are actually Bezier handles. Just like we saw on the pen tool, I could click and drag these around to change the interpolation between point A and point B, play this back, and it's going to travel along that path. So I could customize this however I want and get a very different result with that interpolation between these two keyframes. I'm actually going to undo back to where we were in just a straight line, and I want to add a third keyframe. So let me go forward in time just a little bit, and I'm going to click and drag this up into the center of the frame. This is another one of those things in After Effects that really trips up a lot of people. If I preview this again, you'll notice that as it passes the second keyframe, it kind of hooks around and moves up here, and we can even see that right here with our motion path. Again, I'm holding down spacebar to temporarily switch to my hand tool and clicking and dragging to pan around my comp. This Bezier handle that's coming off of our motion path is automatically introducing this little hook and curve instead of going from point A to point B to point C in a straight line. This is because of the way that After Effects is handling the spatial interpolation, which is just a fancy way of saying the way that After Effects is making things move between keyframes. If I click and drag on this handle, I can readjust this, but now I'm introducing a curve down here because there's actually two handles to that Bezier curve. What I really need to do to get rid of this is go to my pen tool And with that little triangle in the bottom right corner, remember that means there's more tools underneath. So I'll click and hold on that, and down in this menu is the Convert Vertex tool. That's what I'm after. So the pen tool can do more than just edit vector shapes. It can also edit vector motion paths. With this tool selected, I can click on that point right here representing this second keyframe, and it's going to get rid of that roundness, get rid of that extra motion that After Effects is automatically trying to implement in order to smooth out the animation slightly. This is something that generally you just don't want happening. After Effects isn't the greatest at making stuff look smoother on its own. So if there's ever a time that I wanted a curved motion path, that would be something that I'd be introducing manually anyway. So since I don't want that automatic Bezier spatial interpolation, I'm going to tell After Effects to just leave my motion paths alone. Don't start trying to smooth out my animation for me. I'll be the animator here. And I can do that just by going back to the preferences. So I'm going to go up to Edit, down to Preferences, into General, and there's another checkbox that we can enable right here, Default Spatial Interpolation to Linear. If I check that on and click OK, now if I get rid of these keyframes and we'll set some new ones. So why don't we start our shape up here, click the position stopwatch, go forward, drop it down, go forward again, and then click and drag it up. You'll notice my motion trail is now in a straight line or linear. My spatial interpolation is now defaulted to linear, and that's exactly what I want. And if I wanted to play this back without having to continue to just move my playhead back and hit the spacebar over and over again, I can actually do that. After Effects will loop a range that we can set. That's what this bar up here is for. This is called the work area, and this blue handle on the left, that's the in point of the work area. And if I zoom out, again, I can do this even another way by clicking and dragging on this handle up here. I'll zoom all the way out. You'll see that on the right end, it's all the way at the end of my 30-second comp. There's my right work area end handle. I can click and drag this back in, and now After Effects will loop the playback from that point. So I can hit the spacebar again, and it's going to get to the end and loop back around. So setting the work area is a very common thing to do in After Effects, especially when you're previewing animation. So let's zoom back in here, and I want to teach you another keyboard shortcut, actually two shortcuts for setting the work area. They're very simple. For the beginning, it's the B key. So if I go to anywhere in my timeline and I press B, that sets the in point of my work area, and N right next to B on the keyboard, that's the end. So N, end, that's kind of how you can think of it, beginning and end of my work area. Once they're set, you can click and drag anywhere in the middle of it with that double arrow cursor and just shift it around. You can also click and drag on the work area to adjust that, but now it's always going to loop within that range and be much easier to repeatedly preview things. Now, I promise we're going to get into a lot more exciting stuff than just this, but these are the fundamentals of how to set keyframes and specifically position keyframes. Now, we can set a keyframe on any property with a stopwatch, so it doesn't have to just be this position property that generates a motion trail. I could get rid of these keyframes by selecting them and deleting them, or even just clicking on the stopwatch. That will get rid of the whole track of keyframes. Let's say instead of the position, I wanted to animate the scale. Let me go to the beginning. I'll set a keyframe on the scale at this point, go forward a little bit in time, and then scale it up. Again, I could do this by changing the numbers down here, clicking and dragging, or I could click and drag here while holding Shift to constrain my proportions, or I could even come over here into my properties panel. I can even set and adjust keyframes using these controls. These are the same controls that we see down here to go between keyframes and set or remove the current keyframe. I could move somewhere else and click to add another one, or if I'm over top of one, click to get rid of it. I realize I'm throwing a lot at you, but really I just want to show you, once again, there are many ways to do the same things in After Effects. Get in there and start playing around with yourself to find out the way that you like to work. Now that we have two keyframes on the scale, it's going to loop. I'll press N to set my work area a little bit closer to the second keyframe and play back one more time. Now this animation is scaling up. What if I wanted to scale back down to the original keyframe so it kind of loops? Well, I'll just click and drag this keyframe over to speed that up a bit. Then I'll select the first keyframe and copy with Control C, paste with Control V, and now this is going to scale up and down and loop in and out. Now, if you remember, we were talking about the anchor point and how that affects things. The anchor point's right in the center of the square, and that's why it's scaling up and down from the center. But if I were to say go to the end after the animation is completed and I switch to a different tool, the anchor point or pan behind tool, then I can click and drag this anchor point anywhere I want. And I want to point out that the anchor point and position properties are both changing when I do this. So first of all, I'm just going to move it to the bottom left corner roughly and play this back again to show you now my scale animation is still taking place with the same values, but it's scaling from the bottom left corner where I moved the anchor point. I could click and drag that anchor point again and move it to the top way off the layer, and now it's going to scale from that point, which is going to shift it around a lot more. Now, the reason why I pointed out that these two numbers are moving together is to show you that these two numbers are related. These two properties, the anchor point and position, have a relationship. If I were to come down and just adjust the anchor point on its own, that's going to shift the layer around because the position property isn't changing with it. To maintain the relationship between those two, I need to use the anchor point tool. So I need to move that around with the tool in order to get both of these properties to change together. And if I get my position animation back, let me just get rid of the keyframes on the scale, set a position keyframe, and then I'll click and drag this back to the left while holding Shift. That will snap it to either the current time indicator, the work area, or the in and out points of a layer, or even other keyframes. And I'll just snap that to the start of my layer, and then we'll just move this layer around. Now let's say that I'm happy with this animation, but I want that anchor point to actually be centered up again because I didn't notice that it was still a little bit to the left. Well, if I move my playhead to between those two keyframes and switch to my anchor point tool, and then click and drag on that anchor point, you'll see that that's actually modifying my motion path and it's adding a third position keyframe. This is again because when you use the anchor point tool, it's adjusting both the anchor point and position values. And I didn't want that to happen. So if I wanted to move this down to the bottom, I need to first set that anchor point, but then delete that position keyframe. The problem is that's going to shift around the contents of the layer on my other two keyframes. So my point with all of this explanation is to tell you that if you're going to change where your anchor point is, you really should do it before you've set any position keyframes. Otherwise, you're going to have more work to do to get it aligned where it should be. However, here's a little trick for moving things around once they've already been animated. Just click on the position property itself. That will select all of the keyframes on that property. And now I can click and drag with my selection tool to move this around as a whole wherever I want. So if I just wanted to drop that down a little bit, now it's close to where it was originally, but it affected both keyframes. And I could have any number of keyframes in between here. So let's just add some more in randomly. Select all of those keyframes and make sure that my current time indicator is over top of one of them before clicking and dragging to move it as a whole. If my playhead was between two keyframes and I tried to do that, then it's just going to add a fifth keyframe. Now that we have this fundamental understanding of how keyframes work in After Effects, I promise we're going to get into actually making some stuff that looks pretty cool in the next video.